Hello, everyone, and welcome to Overcoming Barriers to Interdisciplinary Scientific Research in EMEA with a Data-Led Approach. This is a Times Higher Education webinar in partnership with Schmidt Science Fellows. My name is Alistair Lawrence. I'm the Head of Branded Content at Times Higher Education, and I'm delighted to be joined today by THE's Chief Data Officer, Duncan Ross, who will lead us through today's discussion. The final 10 minutes of the hour that we have scheduled today will be a Q&A session where attendees can have their questions answered by Duncan. So please put any questions that you have in the Zoom chat box and we will try to answer as many as possible in the time that we have. If there are any questions that we don't have time to answer, we will do our best to follow up with you after the event has ended. So Duncan, without any further ado, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alistair. And welcome everyone to the first of our sessions, looking at some work we have done around trying to understand both the opportunities and the barriers to effective interdisciplinary science research. My name's Duncan Ross. I'm Chief Data Officer for Times Higher Education. I've been working in data for a very long time now, but it's rare that we get the opportunity to do these exploratory analyses that take us into new areas. And really, the importance of interdisciplinary science can't be understated. It is critical that as we face bigger and bigger global challenges, that we use all of the resources available to us to understand and to solve those problems. And just before we go into the main part of the presentation, I would like to start with a video that was produced by the Schmidt Science Fellows that really tries to encapsulate both the challenges and the opportunities for interdisciplinary science.
The world faces incredible problems. The kinds of problems that science can answer, but they are not going to be solved by one particular discipline, looking at it through one lens. Science needs to change. When we started the fellowship program, we had an idea. If scientists could work together and across disciplines, they could make bigger discoveries faster. Discoveries that have a positive impact on the world. We ask our fellows to take a big risk and to pivot into a new discipline during their postdoctoral fellowship. They all come together with this sort of common mission of using their interdisciplinary science to make the world a better place.
We have to be open to new questions, new ways of answering questions
that aren't possible within the confines of a single discipline.
Encouraging young ambitious scientists to move out of their comfort zone and collaborate across disciplines.
We have started to see some great scientific discoveries being formed, but more than that, a community of our fellows, but also of scientists around the world who care about doing science differently to create sector-wide change. We want them to do the moonshots, the things that most of the time are going to fall flat, but that once in a while will do something extraordinary.
Sorry,
The world faces incredible problems.
I now need the joy of being able to move to the next slide, which is, there we go. So you saw there a little bit about what Schmidt Science Fellows are trying to achieve. And they are doing this primarily through this wonderful program that, as Megan talked about, takes individual scholars and gives them the opportunity to explore different scientific disciplines. That is really done with full support there to allow them to actually move freely between those disciplines. And it's a brilliant program. But its challenge, of course, is how to scale up, how to ensure that you don't just have the Schmidt Science Fellows working on these problems, but that all universities can be as interdisciplinary as is possible. because the promise of interdisciplinary science is huge. And this is something that is particularly evident when we look at some of the big challenges we've seen over the last few years. If we think about the challenges of climate change, for example, these are challenges which are really interdisciplinary in nature, that actually we need to combine the best of physics with the best of chemistry, with the best of material science, and so on. We need to understand these things on a broad basis. But of course, the challenge is there are many barriers to interdisciplinary science. And unfortunately, many of those are barriers that the higher education sector itself has created, not because they want to create barriers, but simply because we are based in a tradition that goes back to the cataloguing and classifying of the Enlightenment, a situation where universities split into distinct disciplines that had barriers at their edges. So we started talking to Schmidt Science Fellows, and we have partnered with them. And the goal of this is really to understand, are there opportunities out there that would support universities in developing stronger and more effective interdisciplinary science work? Should those form a ranking or not? But in that process, what can we actually learn about those barriers? And can we see examples of best practice? This webinar series is the first stages of the understanding of our initial data collection. So what we're going to present today is by no means the finished product. It's certainly not a ranking, but hopefully it starts to give us some insights into where opportunities may be, where challenges may exist, and also where we might be able to produce something effective in terms of visibility and measurement. Now, of course, research itself is a complex space. This year in the World University Rankings, we introduced some fairly significant changes to our methodology. And part of that was trying to explore different ways of measuring progress in research. And we started this work in terms of looking at interdisciplinary science back in 2021, where we ran a series of roundtables at our events and also started the process of looking at what data we might be able to collect from universities. Now, the reason that we think that a ranking might, and I emphasize might, be a potential game changer in this space is partly linked to the way that rankings have changed over time. And when I personally think of rankings, and obviously you've probably gathered that I think of rankings rather a lot, I see a typical evolution in terms of the way that organizations like Times Higher Education have thought about the entire process. The earliest rankings were what I would describe as piles of metrics. So people pulled together a series of metrics, each of which they thought meant something to a university. So, for example, student staff ratio tells you something about the resources available for teaching. But typically those very early mechanisms of analysis, those early rankings, just had a set of metrics which had no real relationship to each other. Individually, they may have meant something, but as a grouping, they didn't have any internal coherence or consistency. What I would then describe as the second generation of rankings became something a little more sophisticated. So they tended to have a consistent, coherent theory that underpins their methodology, but they are much more of a statement of what is, or rather what was, than anything else, a statement of record. This university was doing the best work in this particular area at this particular time. However, there is also another potential role for rankings, something that is very evident, for example, in Times Higher Education's impact rankings, where as well as being a statement of record, we think of rankings as a way of encouraging good behavior or best practices in institutions. They become not just a record of what is, but they also become an incentive for universities to improve. Now, at Times Higher Education, we break our rankings down into three broad areas. We look at rankings that focus on teaching. We look at rankings that focus on sustainability, but we also look critically at rankings that focus on research. And the work we're doing here, even though we are not yet at a ranking, is firmly focused in the research area. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a role for interdisciplinary science in teaching. Certainly, there was an article published in Times Higher Education just yesterday that looked at whether or not US universities are teaching their students in an interdisciplinary way. Similarly, you can argue that, as I said earlier, the big challenges around sustainability are undoubtedly interdisciplinary. But the analysis we're doing at the moment is very much looking at the research end of this. So we're exploring how interdisciplinarity is supported within the research world or is hindered within the research world. Now, last year's roundtables took place at a range of different summits around the world. We had one in April in Stockholm. We had the European University Summit in Barcelona, Asian universities in Aichi Province, and the Schmidt Science Fellows global meeting in Boston. And on top of those, we also ran a global virtual roundtable. And the goal of this was really to talk to people who were senior within research in their institutions and start to get an idea of some of the challenges that they saw within the space, things that they thought were barriers in their own experience to good and effective interdisciplinary research. And some of the things that came out of that were around some of the really thorny challenges of how you run an effective research institution. One of the big challenges, of course, is that when you are working across multiple disciplines, you have to deal with the culture of those disciplines, which can be very different. You also have to deal with the challenges of just the mechanics of research, applying for funding, which can often be focused in single disciplines, dealing with the challenge of rewards and recognition. How do we ensure that people who are doing interdisciplinary research are given a fair opportunity for promotion? The challenges also could be around much more practical things. Space, where do you do this research? And also around administrative support. If you are working across multiple departments, one of the things that came out very clearly is that often you end up having to produce twice as much or 3 times as much paperwork to satisfy each of those departments. So there were a range of very different challenges that came out of those roundtables. And we had to start to think about how could we pull those together into a consistent perspective for measurement. And the way we chose to do this is to conceptually think of the challenges in 3 major areas. Firstly, there are the challenges around the inputs. So ensuring that there is appropriate funding for interdisciplinary research, making sure that universities are recruiting for interdisciplinary skills as well as more specific skills. The second stage is thinking about the process in the research life cycle. So does a university actually have measures of success, internal measures of success, so they know when the work that is going on is effective or not? Are there facilities and administration support? Is there encouragement of people who choose to take an interdisciplinary approach? But of course, it's no good just doing interdisciplinary work for the sake of it. We also need to make sure that the results of interdisciplinary science are effective. So at this stage, we started looking at some measurements around bibliometric quality, also some measures around publication rates, ensuring that actually we see a good amount of research being published. And we also looked at aspects of reputation, which universities are known for their interdisciplinarity, and also that thorny challenge of tenure. So this framework gives us a great way of starting to think about how we might measure various aspects of interdisciplinarity. And we can break that down even further. So we can look at the kind of data we might be able to gather from universities, the kind of data we might be able to gather from academia more generally, and what kind of data we might see when we look at bibliometric outputs. Now, at Times Higher Education, we're quite used to gathering data from universities. And traditionally, going back many years in the world university rankings, most of that data has been quantitative in nature. So, for example, we might ask you about the number of students you have, or the number of researchers, or your income. That kind of quantitative data is actually fairly challenging in some instances for universities to provide, but nevertheless, it is fairly straightforward in one respect. It's easy to evaluate and assess and to do quality checks on and so on. But alongside that, we believed it was important for this particular project also to have some qualitative assessments of what universities were doing. And that's particularly important for those things which are less easy to simply enumerate. So, for example, do you provide administrative support? Well, it's really useful to be able to see evidence of what people are providing there. Now, our assessment of qualitative data has to be relatively simple and straightforward. This will never be an in-depth assessment of that qualitative output, but it's designed to give some indicators, firstly, about whether or not universities are even measuring these things, because in some cases they aren't, but also then in terms of, are they able to evidence the work they are doing in that space? Now, alongside the data that we collected from universities directly, we were also very interested in seeing what data was being provided, or what insights were available from academia in general. Part of that comes from a general survey of academia. And there we really wanted to know which universities are seen as having the strongest reputation for interdisciplinary work. But we also wanted to do a more direct assessment of individual universities. Are individual universities actually encouraging academics to do effective interdisciplinary research? Are they enabling them, or do academics feel they are enabled? Do they feel they're awarded? Do they feel they have access to tenure? Now, the final area of data is looking at bibliometric data, so the quality outputs. And there as well, there are some interesting challenges. How do we assess what interdisciplinary research looks like in bibliometric data sets? So let's see what data we received. So last year we went into the field, we asked universities to provide data. Over 1,000 universities provided us with quantitative data about their institutions. Now, sometimes that data was effectively null. So we had situations where a university basically was telling us, you know, we would like to participate, we don't have any data. So 629 of those universities provided complete non-null data. And of those 629 universities, you can see that actually the numbers depended, or the numbers that we got responses to did depend very much on the questions that we were asking. So one of the questions we asked, for example, was about the proportion of research income that is dedicated to interdisciplinary science research. And 521 of those 629 universities were able to provide data for that. Some of that data may be zero, by the way, but it is actually real data. And for example, another question we asked is, what proportion of your job adverts actually explicitly talk about interdisciplinary research? And again, about 530 of the 629 institutions were able to provide that data. On the qualitative side, though, we saw a very different picture. So there we had far more, or a far larger proportion of universities that weren't able to provide data, or who said that they didn't do something. And we'll see a little bit more of that later on. Now, thinking about the survey. So we thought about the survey in two different ways, as I said before. Firstly, there is a general survey where we went out to academics and we asked them their views on which universities are strongest in terms of interdisciplinary science. Now, it's really important that we use that reputational insight alongside more traditional bibliometric measures, because it does give us a very different perspective, and it allows us to account for some of the challenges we will see around bibliometrics as well. We had 14,000 academics who responded to the survey, and they gave us just over 30,000 votes. Interestingly, 3,637 institutions actually received some support in that survey. So you can see actually there is a very broad recognition of the work that is being done in interdisciplinary science. Now, alongside that, of course, we also wanted to ask individual academics. This is a much more challenging approach to take. And if we take this on next year, one of the things we will need to do is find a way of actually expanding our reach in that space. Because as you can see, although we had a reasonable number of responses and we had many thousands of responses, we only had 24 institutions where we had more than 50 responses from that individual institution. Now, that, of course, creates some statistical challenges. With only 24 universities with more than 50 participants, that made those values less reliable. And so in this study, we haven't included that data. I do think in the long run, for individual universities, having a picture of what their own academics think of their approach to interdisciplinarity is a really valuable insight. It is something we want to explore in the future, but obviously we will only be able to do that if we are able to increase the number of responders per institution. Now, for our bibliometrics, we actually used a different data set to our usual data set. So our usual data set, we typically use Elsevier's Scopus data set for this kind of work. And we have an excellent partnership with Elsevier that has been going now for many years. In this particular case, we chose to use OpenAlex, partly because of their approach to classification of subjects for an individual publication. And we'll see why that's important later on. Now, we may go back to using Elsevier. They are continuing to work on their Scopus dataset and make improvements all the time. But at the time we were doing this, we believed OpenAlex was the right approach. OpenAlex had, or has rather, 237 million approximately. They've just released a new snapshot, so it has been updated, but 237 million publications, 47 million of which are in the time period we are interested in. And in a similar way that we do with when we're using Elsevier, we looked at journal articles, book chapters, conference proceedings, books, and peer reviews. Now, interestingly, those 41 million publications actually have 399 million subject tags because of the way that OpenAlex classifies a publication or an article. You can be tagged in multiple different subjects. And that was really important for our analysis. So essentially, every publication within the database can be tagged with more than one subject, and the proportion of the subject is also factored in. So we can do some nice vector calculus on that allows us to see the degree of interdisciplinarity. And that degree of interdisciplinarity is also an important factor. One of the challenges we have here is that some things are clearly more interdisciplinary than others. If we have physics and astrophysics, you could say those subjects are close together. They deal with the same fundamental concepts, whereas physics and biotechnology are much further apart. One of those is more interdisciplinary than the other. And indeed, the boundaries of subjects do change over time. If we think about computer engineering, for example, that started out as very distinct subjects that were very different from each other, but is now recognized as a subject in its own right. So we do expect these things to shift over time. But our data science team pulled together the analysis. They were able to use this approach to essentially score every single paper within OpenAlex for its degree of interdisciplinarity. And we took a decision to effectively assign the top 25% by this score as interdisciplinary. So we created a cutoff there to allow us to identify the interdisciplinary papers. So that's the background. What did the data tell us? Well, the results were quite interesting. For example, when we look at the number of universities providing data to us, and we look at that by country, we can see that the countries who have chosen to participate, or the countries where universities have chosen to participate, is quite intriguing. We see a lot of participation, for example, from Asia. Now, of course, participation doesn't mean that they are necessarily doing great work, but it does indicate a commitment to this particular area. Far lower rates of participation from Europe, and interestingly, Africa being surprisingly strong there as well. So here, for example, for each of these countries, we're looking at the number of submissions who provided some null data, the number of universities who had information on the proportion of their adverts that mentioned interdisciplinarity, and the number of those universities who had data on the proportion of their income that was focused on interdisciplinary research. So some interesting understanding starting to come through there in terms of the willingness to participate in the analysis. And if we dig down into one of those measures in particular, so this is the number of adverts, job adverts that mention interdisciplinarity per staff member. So obviously you have to balance this by the size of the institutions. And again, we see that actually Asian institutions seem to be doing quite well there. Certainly, we see more European institutions. So European institutions are in red, or European countries here are in red. You can see the USA there on the right is actually surprisingly low down on this. These are, of course, box and whisker plots. So the line in the middle represents the median value, and the whiskers are quite interesting because they are telling us a little bit about the universities that have perhaps the most focus on interdisciplinarity. For those of you who know the way box and whisker plots work, of course, there can be points beyond the end of those whiskers as well. When we look at the proportion of research income dedicated to interdisciplinary science research, again, we see a lot of Asian countries are doing quite strongly here. And again, we see a similar pattern that we did before, in the sense that the USA is over here on the right of this chart, and you'll notice that the UK isn't even on it. But it does seem that there is a story that's starting to come out of this, which is that universities in countries which are developing their higher education systems seem to have a greater focus on interdisciplinarity than some of the countries that have had a more long-term tradition of academic research. So if we think about the USA, if we think about the UK, if we think about France, countries that have a long storied tradition and their institutions are often much older, seem to have a less straightforward focus on interdisciplinarity. Now, the numeric data that I showed you is fairly interesting, and I would argue fairly positive. But when we started to look at the data that's coming out of the qualitative measures, then we see challenges that are much more obvious to us. So here we're looking at the number of universities overall who answered particular questions. So one of those questions is, do you provide physical facilities for interdisciplinary science research? The second question is, do you have an internal measurement of success? Would you know what success in interdisciplinarity looks like? The third question is around administrative support. So are you providing dedicated administrative support or additional administrative support for people working in interdisciplinary science? And then finally, we ask, do you have mechanisms in place to ensure that interdisciplinary science is appropriately recognized when it comes to promotion or tenure? And you can see here that actually there are some big challenges. So in terms of physical facilities, I think this is the one where people are, where there is most likely to be a positive answer. So many organizations, many higher education institutions around the world are providing some form of physical facilities, whether that's a building or whether it's a floor or whether it is common facilities. There, roughly half of universities who answered said, yes, we have that facility. And I do think, by the way, there's a really interesting question about, is that actually necessary? Is it important that you bring people together in a physical space? My instincts tell me it is, that actually our work environment is pretty important in terms of our ability to be effective. When we look at measurement of success, though, far fewer institutions have specific ideas about how to assess interdisciplinary research success. And I think that's a good challenge for us to all think about, because if we're not certain what success looks like, it's a genuine barrier to us in terms of developing out this particular form of research. Similarly, the admin support values there are relatively low, and perhaps most worrying of all, the support for promotion is lower still. Now, why is the support for promotion an issue? Well, this was some of the feedback we had from our roundtables. So it was quite clear that if you are in a country like the USA with a tenure track, that actually working in an interdisciplinary way can negatively affect your chances of achieving tenure. Essentially, you aren't seen as or there's the potential that you aren't seen as a great candidate by any of the departments across which you're working. But even in countries where there isn't a formal tenure track, it's clear that actually not being able to demonstrate your skills within a particular discipline can have a negative effect on promotion. So this idea of saying, how can universities explicitly recognize this research or recognize the skill sets required when they're thinking about promotion is an important thing to think about. And again, if we look at the countries that are focused in this area, I should add IPN here should be JPN. For some reason, we have a typo there. It's Japan. Japan is good in terms of physical facilities and admin support there. India is doing generally quite well overall in this. The USA does quite well in terms of measuring success, but a lot less strongly in terms of tenure, as I mentioned before. Countries across Europe, though, Italy, Romania, Spain, and France, starting to recognize both support and facilities. Interestingly, Germany is a little bit stronger when it comes to ensuring that promotion is recognized. So we do see differences across the country. And again, I think one of the things that's worth thinking about is how much of this is to do with the age of institutions. I think there's certainly some evidence there that younger institutions are able to be more nimble and to more readily change some of their approaches to be more effective. But again, going back to the big picture and thinking about countries, and here we're looking at how we assess for each country the comparison between quality, average quality, and intensity, so the proportion of research that is focused on interdisciplinary science. It's a very mixed picture. Now, I should say before I go into the outputs from this, a little bit about the measurement of quality we're using here. So we are using a measure that those of you who know the World University Rankings will be fairly familiar with. It's based on something called field-weighted citation impact. Essentially, it's a way of trying to compare publications on a like-for-like basis. So what you want to say is, I'm comparing similar publications in terms of the number of citations they receive. In this case, we're not using the average across an institution, we're using the 75th percentile to give us a slightly more robust flavor. And I would typically describe this as a measure of typical research quality. So it's not going to identify the very best research, but it's giving us a good idea about what solid interdisciplinary science research looks like. So we can see actually that, and the size of the bubble, by the way, is looking at the amount here. So we can see some clear outliers here. So in terms of both quality and intensity, Singapore and Hong Kong are doing very well. European universities are fairly mixed. The outstanding area here, I'd say, is Germany, and I was trying to get my thought process in place to try and understand why Germany is more focused on interdisciplinary research than some other European countries. I don't have an absolute answer yet. My suspicion is that it might be being impacted by the Max Planck Institutes and the fact that there are these institutes of eminence that have a very clear single disciplinary focus, meaning that universities are actually then able to develop in a more interdisciplinary way. But we do see that there are also parts of Europe where the quality of output is strong as well. We take a slightly different view, though. So this is actually looking at not the proportion, but the actual volumes of publications, in this case, normalized by the square root of the staff. For those of you who are wondering why we use the square root of the staff instead of just the staff numbers, it's based on the acknowledgement that scaling tends not to happen linearly. Doubling the number of people you have tends not to double the outputs you can generate. But here again, we see Singapore and Hong Kong are clear outliers. They are very focused and also producing a large volume of interdisciplinary research. Within Europe, we see the Netherlands, Finland, and Belgium producing significant volume of output. The USA, interestingly, is again kind of midfield here, despite its significant resources. I think one country to look out for in the future is probably Saudi Arabia. So we can see there that the quality of their research is very strong, although the volumes are currently quite low. But with the amounts of investment that they are making in their higher education sector, I am sure that we will see improvements in that over time. Okay, so we're approaching the end of this particular presentation. What kind of things have we learned? Well, the fact that over 1,000 universities started to provide at least some data and almost 700 provided non-null data is very positive. It's an indication that within the higher education sector, universities recognize the importance of interdisciplinary science. And to give you an idea of scale, that compares very favorably to the impact rankings that in their first year had 580 universities participating. However, on the negative side, most institutions are not systematically recording the work they're doing in this space. And in particular, we think that the data suggests that more work, or more measurement at least, needs to be done around aspects of recruitment and recognition of the work that your interdisciplinary scientists are doing. In terms of the research outputs, it's quite clear from those charts I just showed you that on average, Hong Kong and Singapore are leading the way. And we should probably reflect a little bit on why that might be. In Singapore, for example, there is firstly, it has the advantage of being small and focused, but there is no doubt that their Ministry for Education is leading the way on this and is giving strong encouragement to their institutions. There is no doubt that where you have strong positive government input, it certainly helps, both in terms of funding, but also in terms of ensuring that barriers are reduced. Now, China and India are focusing very heavily on ISR, and some of that might again be related to a different tradition of academia. So an academia that isn't quite as bound into the disciplinary structures that we created within Europe. And we do see that the traditional research hubs of the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and to a degree Europe tend to be slightly less interdisciplinary than some other countries. What then will be our next steps? So we are generating a report, or have written a report, on the insights so far. I will show you a QR link to that on the very last slide. I would emphasize we're not expecting that link to go live until 3 p.m. today, but if you take a photo, you can go back to that later. We will continue to highlight opportunities for improvement. I think that's a really critical thing to be doing. And also, we want to continue the conversation with universities about what are the right things to measure. So we think, for example, that the proportion of your job adverts that mention interdisciplinarity is a clear indicator to academics around the world about the importance you place on interdisciplinarity, as well as ensuring that you have the right people applying for roles. However, it isn't very well measured at the moment. So should we be looking at how universities measure that? Should we be looking at how we can assess effectively whether a job advert really is measuring interdisciplinarity? We did, on that point, and I know this is a slight side topic, we did consider actually assessing that ourselves and essentially scraping job adverts and then doing an analysis on those. The barriers to that are, to be honest, around languages and access to job postings across the world and doing that in a fair way. But we will be continuing to have these discussions across this year. This autumn, we will be running a series of roundtables, and do keep your eyes open for those when they are going to be announced. And we still hope that if we can access the right data and if we can ask the right questions, that we would like to be able to generate a ranking looking at this in 2024 or 2025. In the meantime, one of the things that we will be doing, and I should probably add that to this slide, is we hope to add a measure of interdisciplinary output, so one of our bibliometric measures, to the table that shows our World University Ranking. So it won't be part of the ranking itself, but if you go to the rankings page, you will be able to sort on that. And we think that's going to give some interesting insights, again, into the quality of research output in interdisciplinarity that can sit alongside the World University Rankings. Our key recommendations to the sector are these, and this comes out of the report that we've generated. So we absolutely believe that there needs to be more dedicated policy and processes around interdisciplinary science research. So some of that is around physical facilities, but it's also around those support aspects, making sure that there is appropriate administrative support, making sure that there are correct incentives to staff. We clearly believe that there should be more funding on interdisciplinary science. And that's really a challenge not so much to institutions as to our governments and funders. If you really believe that these big challenging problems need an interdisciplinary approach, back that up, put your money where your mouth is and fund the research. And that might require governments to break out of some of the funding mechanisms they have at the moment. Often we see single discipline funding mechanisms, and it's very challenging to break out of that mindset. And we also firmly believe that we need to see greater visibility of the interdisciplinary work that is coming out of the Global South. And this is an aspect that links back to SDG 17 in the Sustainable Development Goals that explicitly calls for stronger relationships between the Global South and the Global North. We believe higher education and interdisciplinary science is one of the key areas where universities can do more in that space. With that, thank you very much for listening to me for the last 45 minutes. As I said before, this QR code will give access to the report, although it won't be going live until 3 p.m. in the UK. But now, if there are questions, it's not too late to ask a question, by the way. Please do put your questions into the Q&A. But thank you very much for listening to me. One final thing, we will, of course, be providing copies of the slides, and we will circulate those to people who registered over the next week. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Duncan. We do have a few questions from the floor, so I'll fire away. Emily Fader asks, are the interdisciplinary questions added to the reputation survey, or was it a separate survey that was conducted by THE?
So this was done in a separate survey. We do want to try and avoid pollution of questions. So this is a common challenge you see when you're trying to generate a survey, is that the responses you get will depend very much on all of the questions you ask in the survey, particularly the ones you ask first. So if you start off by asking general questions about reputation, then the later answers you will get about interdisciplinary science would be affected by the decisions that people had already made. So we wanted to avoid that. So we did this in a totally separate survey. And I think that's the right way to go about this. As I said, otherwise you get this cross-contamination between the questions you're asking. And I should say, by the way, one other thing, we are, for those of you who have received our global academic survey in the past, we are trying to reduce the number of questions we ask in that anyway. So general principle is that you want to keep surveys as short and as focused as possible, not least because we do appreciate the time and effort that people put into answering them, and we don't want to abuse that by having ridiculously long, complicated surveys.
Great, thanks, Duncan. Tara Kelhuli asks, well, it's more of a comment really. The definition of interdisciplinary research is not well known. I think THE and Scopus should define this research in a clear way for universities to be able to collect data. Does that perhaps, I suppose the question there is, can more be done with the taxonomy of defining the terms and also the parameters of this type of work?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there. That the difficulty, of course, is, and there are different flavors. There is interdisciplinary, there is multidisciplinary, there is transdisciplinary, and all of these have slightly different flavors to them. I think they're all heading to the same place, but they do mean slightly different things. I think you're absolutely right that actually there is work to be done around clarity in this. There is, for example, a debate around, so the way we tend to view interdisciplinary is a single piece of research that actually is broadly useful across multiple disciplines and involves the viewpoints and the roles of different disciplines, rather than having different pieces of research done close together. But it is somewhere where there is more work to be done around both the definitions of interdisciplinarity, but also around the measurements as well, and where the edge of measurement comes. So I think that's a really good point.
Great, thanks. And Volodymyr Saitin asks, please explain why the number of votes is more than the number of respondents in your survey.
It's because so I do like questions which are straightforward and have a single answer, rather than my previous fairly waffling answer around interdisciplinarity. So the answer there is because we're not just asking you which is the best, we're asking you for a number of universities that you think are doing a good job. And we do that because this isn't about really trying to come up with a single winner. This is actually trying to understand the broader picture. And if you as a scientist, I assume you're a scientist, but you as a scientist think actually the following 4 universities are all doing really good work, then you should have the opportunity to say that. We're also not asking you to order those, by the way. So we are following the same kind of approach that we use in the global academic survey. That idea of saying vote for the ones that you think are doing a good job. Now, obviously, when it comes to interdisciplinary science, we do get different results than when we look at the global academics survey, which looks at just the best research in your particular subject area. And that's something, again, that we will probably share in future analysis.
Great, thank you. Hopefully this is another one with a fairly straightforward answer to it. Sarah Siekerman asks, are you planning to integrate this work with the World University Ranking?
We aren't in the short term. And I think one of the things that is a genuine criticism of the World University Rankings is that they do rely on a relatively conventional understanding of what subjects are. So there is that inherent subject focus, which is quite important to the mathematics behind that. So one of the things we need to be able to do in the world university rankings is we need to be able to normalize to take account of the different traditions and publishing rates and citation rates that you see in different disciplines. So that's part of that work. For the short to medium term, I think this work stays separate. I think it's an incentive to universities who may be excelling at interdisciplinary research, but are not necessarily able to perform as strongly within the world university rankings. We do want to give that separate incentive. It's something that we should pass back to our advisory boards and take their advice on. The final thing I would say on that, of course, is we did just introduce some fairly major changes to the World University Rankings. I'm pretty nervous about making any other major changes for at least the next few years. So let's see how this goes. Let's see what the ranking, if we get to a ranking, let's see what that shows us and see how useful universities find it before we make that decision.
Great, thank you. And Anne Campbell asked, have you conducted any analysis on the underlying funding behind the research outputs yet?
Not yet. So that's a very challenging thing to do. I mean, it's a great question, and it's one that could be applied more broadly to many institutions in many rankings, which is how effective, what value for money is coming out of this. The difficulties here are getting access to that data on funding. It's something that is varies very significantly from country to country, and in some countries is very visible, in other countries isn't. But I do think, coming back to that point I made earlier, I do think there is a real challenge there around the funding. What we are seeing, certainly, or what we were told during the roundtables, is that often funding is directed in a fundamentally non-interdisciplinary way, and that creates challenges if we think this research is important. So it would be great to be able to do more insight from that. Perhaps that is something that is better left to our editorial team, because they're able to dig into that from a more journalistic approach and certainly focus on different countries. But I'm afraid that's a no, not yet.
Okay, great. We've got one question from an anonymous attendee who asks, thinking of the challenges of sending data during the collection phase, could the next phases of data collection provide more details on what is considered interdisciplinarity as regarding this ranking?
I think that, again, coming back to the earlier question about the definitions and the ontologies, I think that's actually really great feedback. We certainly can do that. I think that's something we try and do with all our rankings anyway, by the way, is that as time goes by, we hope that our advice and guidance gets stronger and stronger, partly because universities ask tough questions. They say, well, what do you mean by this? So we will take that on board, and we will see how we can provide greater insight into that definition. Now, one of the challenges I would say around that is that we want to provide a definition that is as useful as possible, but which doesn't constrain too much. So we do need to recognize that interdisciplinarity, or indeed any definition we have, needs to be flexible enough to be relevant to very different universities in very different countries. So that's the challenge we have, but that's our problem to deal with. What we need to be able to do is give you the insights and the information you need to be able to provide data effectively.
Great, thank you. And I think the last question we're going to have today is, Bushra Salem asks, why was the choice made to use OpenAlex and not develop measurements using the THE subject areas that people have used previously?
So it's partly around the way that, the default way that Elsevier classify subjects within Scopus. Now, as I said, Elsevier are continuing to work on this. It's entirely possible that we may switch back to Scopus in the future as those developments come on stream. But at the time we started this project, essentially Elsevier's subject classification in Scopus often relied on the journal in which an article was published. So everything that's published in the Journal of Physical Sciences, physics letters B, for example, is physics. What we needed was slightly more fine-grained control. So this idea of being able to say that even though this is published in physics letter B, actually physics letter B is pretty single subject, but you could imagine that you might have something in there that was still multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary. And we wanted to be able to have access to do that on an article by article basis. So that was part of the mindset there. OpenAlex has some differences to Scopus. So as I'm sure you're aware, OpenAlex is a searched bibliometric database. It just goes out onto the internet and searches for everything, whereas Scopus is a curated database. Elsevier has a committee whose job is to make sure that only publications of sufficiently high quality are enabled in the database. So that's one of the big differences. And it does mean that you get more noise in OpenAlex than you do in Scopus. Another interesting challenge is around the affiliations. So how we link a publication back to the right university, which is much better in Scopus than it is in OpenAlex. But the key thing for us at this stage of the process was that ability to understand how a single publication related to multiple disciplines. So we will keep an eye on that. We will potentially go back to Elsevier if they can give us the insight we need, or if we can't, we may stick with OpenAlex.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Duncan. I think that's all we're going to cover off today. And thank you to all of you for coming along and joining us. There's been more than 100 attendees in the room. So it's great to see that we've got such strong engagement already. As Duncan says, there will be the preliminary findings published by THE at 3 p.m. this afternoon. So keep an eye out for that. And we will be updating our audience throughout between now and the end of the year with other opportunities to talk to us and also to get involved with this project. Duncan, I'm happy to leave the final words to you if you have anything to close off with.
So my final words are, firstly, a big thank you to every university who chose to participate in data collection in the initial data gathering. It has really helped us to understand this space and understand how we might take things forward. But we do believe that interdisciplinary science is a critical thing for us to be focused on the future, and we do want to progress this project. So please do read the report. Please do send your feedback into us. We would love to hear from you, and we would love to have your participation in any future rounds that might come up. So on behalf of myself and the Times Higher Education team, and on behalf of the Schmidt Science Fellows, thank you so much for listening to us today. Have a great day and a great rest of the week. Thank you.